Here we are 3 days into the new year. We're reporting on the murder of an autistic man.
Number of children who are being diagnosed with autism every day.
Online church will offer a cure for desperate people for virtually every disease, including autism.
Screams all the time and can't speak, and they're trapped in their own body. That's not normal.
5,000 San Diego children are affected by autism. While not forgiving of a child's murder, she believes there is a much deeper story to the young man's death.
I know
this is going to be a complete catastrophe if we just let it happen.
Autism. In the media, this condition is commonly portrayed as a life sentence, an epidemic, a monster that has stolen their children, trapping them inside of their minds, causing seemingly unnatural behaviors that puzzle and frighten parents. But for those on the autism spectrum, it's the loud and confusing world of neurotypicals that isolates them from society. In the 1950s, more children around the ages 2 and 3 were diagnosed with Asperger's and autism, which are now both classified as autism spectrum disorder. The condition marks impairment in social interaction, fixation on special interests, sensory processing disorders, and repetitive behaviors. Yet each of these symptoms can manifest in a spectrum of ways. In the 1980s, Jim Sinclair, widely recognized as the founder of the neurodiversity movement, longed for a way to connect with a society that understood how it feels to live on the spectrum. Reaching out to activists such as Patty Clark, Donna Williams, and Xenia Grant, Sinclair became the spokesperson of Autism Network International, an organization that would lift the voices of those on the spectrum, rather than continuing to center their narrative on their parents and caretakers. Neurotypicals fear the push towards neurodiversity, representing the unknown, a different way of life, the admission that their autistic child is still first and foremost their child. Yet, regardless of the pressure, ANI's activism broke through the barriers of stigma against disabled people to fight for the equality and representation of all people on the spectrum. By Jim Sinclair and fellow activists, created a community for those on the autism spectrum and advocated for more visibility from the neurotypical population through protests, speeches, and gatherings. The group's advocacy brought together an underrepresented group and defied the stereotype that autistic people are unable to represent themselves in society, increasing their social autonomy and pride in their abilities and selves. At the time, most autism spaces that were available were controlled by parents, therapists, and private corporations, a problem that still exists today. Sinclair wished to form a space where autistics were no longer dictated by the standards of neurotypical society, a place that allowed them to reach their full potential and become normal without forcing them to be typical. In 1992, Sinclair, alongside fellow autistic advocates Xenia Grant and Donna Williams, attended a conference in New Jersey, during which the three of them shared a residence. This was the first time any of them had lived alongside other autistic people, and to Sinclair, this event was eye-opening. Here they planted the seeds for a new organization, one that would connect and unite those on the spectrum around the country and the world. This organization became known as Autism Network International. 4 years later, Sinclair's efforts began to come together. The group had already begun sending out a monthly newsletter, but was still lacking the community that Sinclair desired. Sure, this group of autistic people can now finally share the struggles they face due to their differences, but those struggles were still present. Autreat was their solution. At the 3-week retreat, attendees were able to dictate their own social needs with little pressure from others. Though allowed to bring family members and caretakers, the majority of the population of Autreat was autistic, something most people had never experienced before. They held the freedom of self-expression, allowing non-harmful behaviors that therapists may force them to repress in order to conform, and had a code to express their limits in social interaction.
Green means welcome anybody to come talk to you. Red means you want to just have your own thoughts to yourself and don't want anybody to come talk to you. And yellow, which is in here, I can pull it out, means only people you know you'd like to come talk to you, not strangers. Just come up.
Sinclair's organization moved the perspective of both those on the spectrum and those who were unaware of autistic struggles from a cure-centered ideology to one that valued the opinions of autistic individuals. Since the 80s, more autistics have been allowed positions at organizations that represent them, largely due to the push for self-advocacy by ANI supporters. However, they did face opposition, mostly by neurotypical parents of autistic children. Initially, autism was described as childhood psychosis and seen as an issue of nurture rather than nature. In Sinclair's time, many people still believed that autism was a disease that had stolen their child, blaming the condition on milk, vaccines, mercury, and bad parenting. Many autistics were institutionalized if no families would care for them. Groups of self-proclaimed autism moms felt threatened by the growing presence of disabled voices beginning to speak up against these myths, grasping for reasons to defame the group due to their own ableist biases. Therefore, public recognition was also an issue. After requesting a conference spot from the Autism Society of America, board members refused to allow them a spot without a neurotypical board member taking over their organization. But their advocacy made its first step after the New York University Child Study Center published a series of controversial ads. These ads used frightening messages of ransom notes claiming to have kidnapped their children. ANI's members and supporters took to message boards, email groups, and news sites to get coverage of the campaign. The outrage marked a union between autistic advocates and supportive parents, taking offense to the threatening messages directed toward their children. Eventually, the messages warranted the removal of the campaign as well as an apology from the director of NYU. In their most influential speech, transcribed from a 1993 conference, Sinclair directly challenges parents that view their autistic children as burdens. They recognize that these children might behave differently from neurotypicals, making parenting difficult for those who don't understand these differences. It is not the fault of the child. You didn't lose a child to autism. You lost a child because the child you waited for never came into existence. That isn't the fault of the autistic child who does exist, and it shouldn't be our burden. We need and deserve families who can see us and value us for ourselves, not families whose vision of us is obscured by the ghosts of children who never lived. Grieve if you must, for you lost your own dreams. But don't mourn for us. We are alive, we are real, and we're waiting for you. The inclusivity of ANI's programs and activism united people of all abilities and experiences under the autism spectrum, and its merging of the diagnoses of Asperger's and autism, instead of segregating between arbitrary functioning labels, contributed to the start of the neurodiversity movement and the breaking of stereotypes in the view of the public. Before ANI, conferences requested Sinclair form a group to support high-functioning autistics, or those who could speak and live independently. Sinclair rejected this offer, disagreeing with the idea that nonverbal autistics should be excluded from their own community, when their population was more at risk. In fact, Sinclair himself was nonverbal until the age of 12, and thought though they were able to survive on their own, they hardly felt part of a higher-functioning group. With this experience, Sinclair noted the way that neurotypicals view the spectrum may be different from the reality of autism. The spectrum, as Sinclair describes it, covers all aspects of functioning, not just speech and comprehension.
One of the things that one may never have associated with autism, especially if all the information you have about autism is what you see in the literature, which is all negative and kind of biased towards seeing autism as pathological.
Autism exists.
While neurotypicals viewed as a scale of not autistic to Asperger's, socially awkward yet gifted or able to fit in, to severely autistic, unable to speak or take care of oneself, Jim Sinclair pushed for a more holistic view. They divided the population into those who are autistic and those who are allistic, or not on the spectrum. Everyone on the spectrum might have a different manifestation of autistic traits, but no one was more or less autistic because of them. Throughout history, disabled Americans have been sentenced to choose between masking to neurotypical standards or being erased from historical significance. Sinclair and fellow activists, as part of Autism Network International, provided a voice from within the community, finally giving a silenced group of people not only recognition from the typical world, but a support system of those who share their experiences. ANI paved a road for activists to stand up for their own causes, rather than letting those who pity autistics use their platform to promote eugenics or for personal gain. Now, autistic people are free to be activists, comedians, actors, and singers, without having to hide their diagnosis. Sinclair taught the nation that to break barriers between the neurotypical world and the autistic world, one does not need to eradicate autism. One must eradicate prejudice.